"Get up, kid. Move to the back where you belong." Richard Caldwell's voice boomed through the first-class cabin as he towered over the 19-year-old in seat 1A. What Richard didn't know was that the quiet teenager he was humiliating owned more airline stock than Richard would earn in a lifetime. As the flight attendant sided with wealth over justice, demanding the young man relocate for a fabricated weight distribution error, every passenger watched in stunned silence. The kid calmly reached for his phone. Richard smirked, thinking he'd won. He had no idea that one phone call would obliterate his career, his reputation, and everything he thought made him untouchable. Sometimes karma doesn't wait. He saw someone who didn't belong. He demanded the teenager move to the back of the plane where he belonged. It was a fatal miscalculation. One simple phone call was about to systematically dismantle a man's career reputation and ego, proving that karma doesn't just strike, it obliterates. John F. Kennedy International Airport was a chaotic symphony of rolling luggage, frantic announcements, and stressed travelers. But inside the exclusive Sovereign Lounge of Atlantic Continental Airlines, the atmosphere was entirely different. Here the chaos of New York City was muted behind triple-upped glass and drowned out by the soft clinking of crystal champagne flutes. Triton Sterling sat quietly in a leather wingback chair in the far corner of the lounge. At 19, Triton, or Trey, to his family possessed a quiet, unassuming demeanor that belied his background. He was dressed for comfort on the impending 7-hour flight to London. A black, unmarked hoodie-tailored charcoal sweatpants and immaculate white sneakers. To the untrained eye, he looked like any average teenager. A seasoned observer, however, might have noticed that the hoodie was a custom cashmere blend worth more than most people's monthly rent, and the watch slipping out from beneath his cuff was a rare pockpipe, a graduation gift from his father. Trey wasn't interested in showing off. He had his noise, and selling headphones on, deeply engrossed in a thick hardcover book on international trade law. He was heading to London to shadow the European division of his father's conglomerate, Sterling Global. His father, Arthur Sterling, was a man whose name moved markets, a titan in global logistics and a major shareholder in several international airlines, including Atlantic Continental. But Trey had been raised to be grounded, respectful, and entirely self-sufficient. The serene quiet of the lounge was abruptly shattered by a loud, booming voice near the entrance. "What do you mean, the massage therapist is on break? Do you know who I am? I am a Diamond Elite member." Trey glanced up from his book. Striding into the lounge was a man in his late 50s, his face flushed with indignation. He wore a sharp, albeit overly flashy, tailored suit that screamed new money. This was Richard Caldwell, the recently promoted Senior Vice President of Acquisitions for Vanguard Holdings, a mid-tier real estate firm. Beside him stood his wife, Beatrice, a woman draped in designer logos. Her expression, a permanent haughty sneer as she looked down at the lounge attendant. "I apologize, Mr. Caldwell," the attendant said, smoothly, clearly used to handling inflated egos. "She will be back in 15 minutes. May I offer you a complimentary glass of Dom Perignon while you wait?" Richard scoffed, snatching the offered glass without a word of thanks. Unbelievable. The service in this country is going down the drain. "Come on, Beatrice. Let's find a seat away from the rabble." Trey watched them briefly before returning his attention to his book. He had encountered men like Richard Caldwell his entire life, men who equated volume with authority and wealth with superiority. Trey simply turned up the volume on his headphones, letting the smooth sounds of jazz wash over him. An hour later, the boarding announcement for Flight 408 to London Heathrow echoed through the lounge. As a passenger in Seat 1, a Trey was among the first to board. He gathered his carry-on, a sleek leather duffel, and made his way down the jet bridge. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was a marvel of modern aviation. It featured private pods with sliding doors, fully live flatbeds, and massive entertainment screens. Trey found his seat at the very front left of the aircraft. He stowed his bag, slid into the plush, spacious seat, and let out a sigh of relief. He loved flying. There was a peaceful isolation to being in the air, a temporary pause from the heavy expectations that came with the sterling name. A flight attendant approached him with a warm smile. Her name tag read Sarah. "Welcome aboard, sir. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage, champagne water, or perhaps some juice? Just sparkling water with a lime, please." "Thank you, Sarah," Trey replied politely. Sarah nodded, though her eyes lingered on his hoodie for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was a subtle look, one Trey was entirely used to. It was the look of someone trying to calculate how a young black kid in casual streetwear had managed to afford a $12,000 one-way ticket. She didn't say anything, however, and quickly brought him his water. 15 minutes later, the main rush of first-class passengers began to filter in. Among them were Richard and Beatrice Caldwell. Richard was already complaining about the temperature of the jet bridge as he stepped into the cabin. He looked down at his boarding pass, then up at the overhead numbers. Row 2. "Beatrice, why are we in row 2? I told my assistant to specifically book row 1. "Don't look at me, Richard." Beatrice sighed, adjusting her silk scarf. "You know how incompetent your staff is." Richard frowned, his eyes scanning the front of the cabin. His gaze landed on seat 1A. He stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting in the prime seat of the aircraft, the seat Richard felt he rightly deserved, was a black teenager in a hoodie, sipping water and scrolling through his phone. Richard's eyes narrowed. The gears in his head began to turn, fueled by a potent mixture of arrogance, inherent bias, and corporate entitlement. In Richard's worldview, first class was a sanctuary for people like him, executives, power brokers, the elite. It was not a playground for kids who looked like they belonged on a basketball court or a skate park. "Hold on a second," Richard muttered to his wife, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "There's obviously been a massive ticketing error. I'm going to sort this out. Richard, don't make a scene." Beatrice said, though she didn't sound particularly opposed to the idea. I'm not making a scene, darling. I'm correcting a mistake." Richard puffed out his chest, adjusted his tie, and marched straight toward seat 1A. Trey was completely unaware of the approaching storm, his focus directed out the window at the bustling tarmac. He was just reaching to slide the privacy door of his pod shut when a heavy hand slapped down on the partition, physically stopping the door from closing. Trey looked up, surprised, pulling one side of his headphones off his ear. Richard Caldwell stood over him, looking down his nose with an expression of undisguised condescension. "Excuse me, son." Richard said, his tone dripping with fake politeness. "I think you're in the wrong section. Coach is that way toward the back." Trey blinked, processing the sudden intrusion. He looked at the older man, taking in the red, arrogant face and the aggressive posture. He maintained his composure, refusing to let the disrespect rattle him. "I'm sorry." "Excuse me," Trey said, his voice calm and even. "I said." Richard spoke louder, enunciating his words, as if speaking to a child or someone who didn't understand English. "You are in the wrong seat. This cabin is first class. It requires a specific ticket. The economy section is through those curtains." He pointed a thick, manicured finger toward the rear of the plane. Trey didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into the pocket of his hoodie, retrieved his sleek black boarding pass, and held it up. The bold text clearly read, "Sterling/Trayton. Seat 1A first." "I believe I am exactly where I am supposed to be," Trey said. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to close my door." Richard stared at the boarding pass, his face flushing a deeper shade of crimson. The undeniable proof was right in front of him, yet his bruised ego refused to accept it. He couldn't fathom that this teenager had legitimately secured a seat better than his own. "Let me see that," Richard demanded, reaching out to snatch the ticket. Trey swiftly pulled his hand back, a cold glint appearing in his dark eyes. "Do not touch my property. I suggest you find your assigned seat and leave me alone." The word "no" was not something Richard Caldwell was accustomed to hearing, especially not from someone he deemed beneath him. His fake politeness evaporated instantly, replaced by sheer outrage. "Listen here, you little punk," Richard hissed, leaning into Trey's personal space. I don't know whose frequent flyer miles you stole or what kind of clerical error put you in this seat, but I am a Diamond Elite member with this airline. I fly 100,000 meters a year. I belong in row 1. You are going to get up, and you are going to move." The commotion had begun to attract the attention of the other passengers. Beatrice watched from the aisle with a look of mild amusement, while a few other executives peered over the tops of their reading glasses. Sarah, the head flight attendant, hurried down the aisle, her face etched with professional concern. "Gentlemen, is there a problem here?" "Yes, there is a massive problem," Richard snapped, turning his fury onto Sarah. "This kid is sitting in my preferred seat. I am Richard Caldwell. I demand that you relocate him immediately. He's clearly playing some sort of prank or exploited a glitch in your system." Sarah looked from Richard's furious face to Trey's calm, seated posture. The pressure of the situation weighed heavily on her. Airline policy was strictly drummed into her: never upset the elite status members. They paid the bills. They wrote the complaints that got crews fired. She looked at Trey Young Black, wearing a hoodie. Her subconscious biases, the same ones that had made her stare earlier, flared to life. Surely Mr. Caldwell was right. A kid like this in 1A. It had to be a mistake, or an employee pass writer, or a lottery upgrade. In her mind, Trey was expendable. Richard Caldwell was not. "Sir," Sarah said softly, addressing Trey, her tone patronizing. "May I please see your boarding pass?" Trey held it up again, making sure she could read the name and seat number. "As you can see, Sarah, I am ticketed for 1A, Sarah bit her lip. She saw the name, but the pressure from Richard, who was now tapping his foot impatiently, was overwhelming. She made a disastrous decision. She chose to prioritize the wealthy, loud white man over the quiet black teenager hiding behind the guise of customer service. "Mr. Sterling." "Yes, I see that," Sarah stammered, improvising a lie. "However, it appears there has been a weight distribution error in our system. Sometimes the computer double books the front row to balance the aircraft because Mr. Caldwell is a Diamond Elite member. His status takes precedence in these rare overbooking scenarios." Trey stared at her. A weight distribution error. On a Boeing 777 that weighs over 500,000 pounds. My 160 pounds is throwing off the balance. A few passengers within earshot chuckled softly at the absurdity of the excuse. Sarah turned bright red. "It's an automated system glitch, sir," she insisted, her voice hardening as she doubled down on her lie to save face. "I am going to have to ask you to relocate to the main cabin. We have a very comfortable premium economy seat available in row 14. As compensation for the inconvenience, I can offer you a $500 flight voucher for future travel." Richard stood tall, a triumphant smug grin spreading across his face. He crossed his arms, looking down at Trey. "There you go, kid. $500. You can buy yourself some proper clothes. Now get up." Trey didn't move an inch. He looked at Sarah, his expression perfectly composed, though his voice dropped an octave, carrying a chilling authority that seemed far too mature for a 19-year-old. "Sarah, let me be absolutely clear," Trey said. "I'm not an employee on a buddy pass. I'm not an upgrade. My family paid full retail fare for this specific seat. I am well aware of FAA regulations and airline policies. You are blatantly lying to me to appease an aggressive passenger who feels entitled to my space." Sarah gasped, taken aback by his articulate and direct pushback. "Sir, I am trying to resolve a ticketing issue." "You are trying to bully a teenager out of his seat," Trey interrupted smoothly. He shifted his gaze to Richard. "And you, Mr. Caldwell, are embarrassing yourself." Richard's face contorted with rage. "How dare you speak to me like that? Sarah, I want this disrespectful little thug removed from this flight. He's being threatening. I feel threatened." It was the classic weaponization of fear. Threatening thug. The coded language hung heavy in the air. Sarah, panicking that a Diamond Elite member was escalating the situation, completely lost her professional bearing. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice shaking but firm, "if you do not comply with my instructions and move to row 14, immediately I will be forced to call the captain and have airport security remove you from this aircraft for failure to comply with crew member instructions. This is your final warning." The cabin fell dead silent. The threat of security was the ultimate trump card. In the post-9/11 era of aviation, a passenger refusing a flight attendant's order was a fast track to being dragged off the plane in handcuffs, regardless of who was right. Richard smirked, leaning against the overhead bin. "You heard the lady? Time to go, kid." Trey looked at Sarah. He saw the fear and the stubborn bias in her eyes. He looked at Richard Caldwell, seeing a man whose entire life had been built on stepping on people he deemed lesser. Triton Sterling took a deep breath. He had tried to be polite. He had tried to be reasonable. His father had always told him, "Never start the fire, Trey. But if someone brings a torch to your house, you burn their whole forest down." "I understand," Trey said softly. Sarah let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you, sir. If you'll just gather your things." "I didn't say I was moving," Trey corrected her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I said, I understand. You've given me your ultimatum. Now before you call security to come drag me out of a seat I own, I am going to make one phone call." Richard laughed loudly. "Who are you going to call, kid, your mommy? Tell her the big bad airline was mean to you." Trey unlocked his phone, his thumb hovering over his contacts. He didn't look at Richard. He looked dead into Sarah's eyes, and for the first time she felt a sudden icy knot form in her stomach. "No," Trey said softly. "I'm calling the chairman of the board of this airline. I'm calling my father." The air in the first-class cabin grew so thick with tension, it felt hard to breathe. Other passengers had completely abandoned their books and laptops, openly watching the spectacle unfold. Richard Caldwell stood with his chest puffed out, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face, fully expecting the teenager to fold under the pressure. Beside him, Sarah, the flight attendant, looked visibly relieved that the situation was finally resolving itself in favor of the Diamond Elite member. She had no idea the ground was about to open up beneath her feet. Trey held his phone to his ear. It rang only twice before a deep, resonant voice answered. "Trey, flight radar shows you haven't pushed back from the gate yet. Everything all right?" Arthur Sterling's voice was warm, the tone of a father checking in on his son. "There's been a slight delay, Dad." Trey replied, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent cabin. "A passenger named Richard Caldwell has decided he wants my seat. He feels I don't belong here." Richard let out a short bark-like laugh. "Oh, please give it a rest, kid. Your dad can't save you from airline policy." Trey ignored him, keeping his eyes locked on Sarah. "The flight attendant, Sarah, is backing him up. She claims there is a weight distribution error on this 777. And because Mr. Caldwell is a Diamond Elite member, my paid ticket is void. She has given me an ultimatum: move to row 14, or she calls airport security to have me dragged off the aircraft." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Arthur Sterling spoke again, the warmth was completely gone. In its place was the freezing, calculated edge of a man who commanded a multi-billion-dollar global empire. "Put her on speakerphone, Trey, right now." Trey pulled the phone from his ear and tapped the speaker icon, holding it out. "Sarah." Arthur's voice emanated from the device, commanding and unyielding. "This is Arthur Sterling, chairman of the board and majority shareholder of Atlantic Continental Airlines. You have exactly 10 seconds to explain to me why you are threatening my son with security over a seat I personally purchased for him." Sarah's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The tablet in her hand suddenly felt like a block of lead. The name Arthur Sterling wasn't just a name. It was a legend within the company. He was the man who had saved the airline from bankruptcy 5 years prior. His portrait hung in the corporate headquarters. I Sarah stammered, her professional facade crumbling into sheer terror. "Mr. Sterling, I was just following. I mean," Mr. Caldwell was very insistent. "So you chose to invent a ridiculous lie about weight distribution to illegally downgrade a paying passenger to appease a bully." Arthur interrupted, his voice cutting through the cabin like a whip. "Is that the standard of training Atlantic Continental is providing these days?" Richard, however, was not convinced. His ego flatly refused to process the reality of the situation. "Nice try, kid," Richard boomed, waving his hand dismissively. "You got your friend to pretend to be the chairman. Do you think we're stupid?" The chairman of the airline doesn't have a kid who dresses like a street hoodlum. Call security, Sarah. I'm done playing games. Mr. Caldwell. Arthur's voice spoke through the phone, dangerously soft. I suggest you remain exactly where you are. Trey put the phone on mute and do not move a muscle. I am calling operations. The line clicked dead. Trey calmly set his phone down on the center console and crossed his arms, leaning back into his plush seat. He looked up at Richard, whose smug smile was beginning to falter at the edges, replaced by a microscopic sliver of doubt. You're making a massive mistake, Richard muttered, adjusting his tie nervously. When security gets here, you're going to be in handcuffs. We'll see, Trey replied evenly. Less than 90 seconds later, the heavy door to the cockpit swung open with a sharp click. Captain David Harrison, a veteran pilot with 30 years of experience, stepped out into the galley. He looked pale, his jaw set tightly. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't look at Richard. He marched directly down the aisle, stopping squarely in front of seat 1A, Mr. Triton Sterling. Captain Harrison asked, his tone laced with absolute respect. Yes, Captain, Trey answered. Captain Harrison let out a heavy breath. I just received a direct emergency priority call from the Central Operations Dispatcher. They had the CEO of the airline on the line. I want to personally apologize to you for the abysmal treatment you have received on my aircraft. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. A collective gasp echoed through the first-class cabin. Beatrice, Richard's wife, sank lower into her seat in row 2, suddenly finding the in-flight magazine incredibly fascinating. Sarah leaned against the galley bulkhead, her hands covering her mouth. Tears of absolute panic welling in her eyes. The realization of her monumental error, driven by her own unchecked biases, crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had tried to kick off the chairman's son. Her career was effectively over. Richard Caldwell stood frozen in the aisle. The color had completely vanished from his usually ruddy face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. His brain was misfiring desperately, trying to reconcile his inherent prejudice with the undeniable truth unfolding before him. Captain, there must be a mistake. Richard stammered, his voice losing all its previous volume and authority. I am a Diamond Elite. Step back, Sir Captain Harrison ordered, turning to Richard with a glare that could melt steel. Your frequent flyer status does not give you the right to harass, intimidate, or discriminate against other passengers. You have severely violated airline code of conduct by threatening a guest and interfering with my flight crew. He was in my seat, Richard protested weakly, grasping at straws. It is not your seat, Mr. Caldwell, the captain retorted sharply. It is Mr. Sterling's seat, and frankly, considering his family practically owns the metal tube we are currently standing in, he has more right to it than anyone else on board. Trey watched Richard unravel. He didn't feel joy or triumph. He only felt a profound sense of exhaustion. It was exhausting having to constantly prove his right to exist in certain spaces, but his father had taught him that true power wasn't about being loud. It was about leverage. Trey picked up his phone, tapping the screen to pull up a file he had been studying in the lounge. You said your name was Richard Caldwell, correct? Trey asked, his voice calm and analytical. Richard swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Yes. And you mentioned in the lounge that you are the Senior Vice President of Acquisitions for Vanguard Holdings. Trey continued reading from the screen. Richard's eyes widened. How do you know that I read the corporate DOSes for the companies my family's conglomerate does business with? Trey explained, looking up and meeting Richard's terrified gaze. Vanguard Holdings has been desperately trying to secure a joint venture with Sterling Global's European division for the Canary Wharf commercial real estate expansion. It's a multi-billion-dollar deal. In fact, looking at the itinerary here, you are flying to London today to make the final pitch to our board tomorrow morning. The cabin was so silent, you could hear a pin drop. Richard looked as though he might physically collapse. His legs trembled. The aggressive, entitled executive had vanished, replaced by a man staring down the barrel of total professional ruin. Mr. Sterling, Trey, please. Richard begged, his voice cracking entirely, abandoning his previous bravado. It was a misunderstanding. I was stressed. I've been under a lot of pressure at work. I didn't mean any disrespect. Please, let's just forget this happened. I'll go to row 2. I won't say another word. You didn't need to know who I was, Mr. Caldwell, Trey said quietly, the profound weight of his words echoing in the silence. You just needed to treat me like a human being. You looked at me, saw my skin color and my clothes, and decided I was beneath you. You decided I was disposable. You weaponized the flight attendant and threatened me with police action over your own bruised ego. Trey paused, locking eyes with the older man. My father is a very protective man, but he is also a very practical businessman. He does not partner with liabilities, and a senior executive who abuses strangers in public based on racial profiling is a massive liability. Captain Harrison stepped forward, his radio in hand. Mr. Sterling Operations has left the final call to me per standard protocol for disruptive passengers. What would you like me to do? Trey looked at Richard, then over to Beatrice, who was now glaring daggers at her husband for destroying their golden ticket to the upper echelon of high society. Finally, Trey looked at Sarah, who was openly weeping in the galley, terrified of losing her livelihood. Captain, Trey said clearly. Mr. Caldwell stated earlier that he felt threatened by my presence and demanded security remove the thug from the plane. For the safety and comfort of all passengers, I believe it's best we accommodate his concerns about security. Captain Harrison nodded firmly. He lifted his radio to his mouth. Operations, this is Captain Harrison on Flight 408. Send Port Authority Police to Gate B12. We have a disruptive passenger refusing crew instructions. We need him offloaded immediately. No, please. Richard cried out, reaching a hand toward Trey, only to have the captain step between them. You can't do this. If I miss this meeting, my CEO will fire me. I'll lose everything. You did this to yourself, Richard, Beatrice hissed from her seat, finally speaking up, entirely abandoning her husband to save face. You and your massive, fragile ego. Within minutes, 3 Port Authority police officers boarded the aircraft. The sight of the uniformed officers, the very weapon Richard had tried to use against Trey now coming for him, was the ultimate bitter pill of karma. Sir, gather your belongings and come with us, the lead officer instructed, gesturing to Richard. Do you know who I am? Richard tried one last desperate time, though it sounded pathetic, even to his own ears. Yes, sir. You're the man holding up my flight, Captain Harrison said coldly. Off my plane now. Defeated, humiliated, and broken. Richard Caldwell retrieved his briefcase. As he was escorted down the aisle toward the exit, he didn't dare look back at seat 1A. The executives who had earlier watched the spectacle with amusement now actively turned their heads away, treating Richard like a pariah. Once the doors closed behind the police, Captain Harrison turned to Sarah. You and I will be having a very long discussion with Human Resources the moment we land in London. For now, you are relieved of first-class duties. Go work the economy galley. Sarah nodded, wiping her face, unable to even look Trey in the eye as she retreated to the back of the plane. Captain Harrison turned to Trey one last time. Again, Mr. Sterling, my deepest apologies. Thank you, Captain, Trey said, finally, sliding the privacy door of his pod shut. Have a safe flight. As the Boeing 777 finally pushed back from the gate, Triton Sterling picked up his phone. He had a text message from his father. Just got off the phone with Vanguard Holdings CEO. The Canary Wharf deal is dead. Caldwell is being terminated upon landing. Enjoy London, son. Love, Dad. Trey smiled softly, putting his headphones back on and opening his book. The flight to London, he decided, was going to be incredibly peaceful. High above the Atlantic Ocean, cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet, the interior of Flight 408 was a study in stark contrasts. Inside the sealed temperature-controlled sanctuary of his first ASPOD, Triton Sterling was the picture of absolute serenity. The ambient lighting of the cabin had been dimmed to a soft starlit blue. He had finished his reading on international trade law, enjoyed a meticulously plated dinner of seared sea bass and roasted asparagus, and was now comfortably reclined in his lie-flat bed, listening to a curated jazz playlist. He didn't harbor any lingering rage toward Richard Caldwell. To Trey, anger was a wasted emotion, a chaotic energy that clouded judgment. His father had taught him that the world was full of small-minded people who operated on outdated hierarchies and visual prejudices. You cannot control their ignorance, Trey Arthur Sterling had told him on his 18th birthday. But you can entirely control the consequences of it. Trey had simply applied leverage. The system had tried to crush him. He had merely reminded the system who owned it. Several rows behind him, still in the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was decidedly different. Beatrice Caldwell sat rigid in seat 2 by her untouched glass of vintage champagne, growing warm on the console beside her. She stared blankly at the entertainment screen, her mind racing through a catastrophic calculus. Beatrice was a woman who had married for status, wealth, and the social armor that came with the Caldwell name. Richard's sudden public removal from the aircraft was not just an embarrassment. It was a financial death sentence. She had heard the quiet murmurings of the other executives in the cabin. She knew exactly what Sterling Global was, and she knew that Richard's impulsive racist tirade had just detonated Vanguard Holdings' most critical deal of the decade. As she gripped the armrests of her plush seat, Beatrice wasn't thinking about her husband's feelings or his humiliating walk back through the terminal. She was mentally cataloging their marital assets, estimating the value of their Hampton estate, and composing a draft text to her divorce attorney. The marriage was over the moment Richard was escorted off the plane. She refused to go down with his sinking ship. Further back, past the heavy curtains that separated the elite from the masses, the reality of karma was currently unfolding in the cramped, chaotic galley of the economy cabin. Sarah Jenkins, formerly the lead first-class flight attendant, was now pushing a heavy, dented beverage cart down the narrow aisle of row 42. Her pristine uniform felt suffocating. Her eyes were bloodshot from crying in the lavatory, and her hands shook slightly as she poured sodas over plastic cups of ice. The transition from the serene, whisper-quiet front of the plane to the packed, noisy reality of coach was a brutal shock to her system. Here, passengers were demanding. Babies were crying, and the space was suffocatingly tight. But worse than the physical environment was the crushing weight of her own actions. Every time she handed a ginger ale to a passenger, her mind replayed the confrontation. She had looked at a brilliantly educated, wealthy, polite young man, and because he was black and wearing a hoodie, she had instantly categorized him as a threat and a fraud. She had chosen to lie to invent a weight distribution error simply to cater to the aggressive demands of an entitled white man. Failure to comply with crew member instructions. She had actually threatened to have the chairman's son arrested. "Excuse me, miss." A passenger snapped from the window seat, jarring her back to reality. "I asked for diet. This is regular." I am so sorry, sir." Sarah stammered, her voice trembling. She swapped the cup, her cheeks burning with shame. She knew what awaited her in London. Captain Harrison had been explicitly clear. Human resources would be waiting at the gate. Her career with Atlantic Continental, a job she had spent 6 years working toward, was effectively over. She had sacrificed her integrity for a man who didn't even know her name, and she was paying the ultimate price. 7 hours later, the heavy tires of the Boeing 777 kissed the tarmac of London Heathrow Airport. The gray, overcast English sky matched the somber mood of half the passengers on board. As the aircraft taxied to a halt, Trey gathered his leather duffel. The moment the seatbelt sign chimed off, the cockpit door opened and Captain Harrison stepped out, personally escorting Trey to the front exit before anyone else could move. "A private vehicle is waiting for you on the tarmac, Mr. Sterling," the captain said warmly, extending his hand. "On behalf of the flight crew, we hope the rest of your journey is exceptional." "Thank you, Captain," Trey replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. "I appreciate your professionalism." Trey descended the stairs to the tarmac, where a sleek black Bentley Mulsanne was waiting, its engine purring quietly. A sharply dressed chauffeur opened the rear door. As Trey slid into the luxurious leather interior, he glanced back up at the plane. He saw Beatrice Caldwell standing at the top of the stairs, looking pale and furious. Her designer luggage suddenly seeming very heavy. He also saw Sarah looking out one of the small economy windows, her face a mask of total defeat. Trey turned away the tinted window, rolling up, shutting out the airport noise. It was time to go to work. The European headquarters of Sterling Global was a towering monolith of glass and steel situated in the heart of Canary Wharf. It was a fortress of modern capitalism, a place where fortunes were made and erased with the stroke of a pen. The next morning, inside the cavernous glass-walled boardroom on the 45th floor, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Seated on one side of a massive mahogany table were three executives from Vanguard Holdings. At the center sat Thomas Harrington, the CEO of Vanguard, a man who looked as though he had aged 10 years in the past 12 hours. Beside him sat his chief financial officer, Simon Croft, who was nervously tapping a gold pen against his notepad. The third chair, reserved for their senior vice president of acquisitions, was glaringly empty. Thomas Harrington wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. His phone had been blowing up since 3 a.m. He had received frantic, borderline hysterical calls from Richard Caldwell trying to explain how a misunderstanding over a seat had led to him being thrown off the flight and arrested by Port Authority for disturbing the peace. But Thomas knew it wasn't a simple misunderstanding. He had received a terrifyingly brief email directly from Arthur Sterling's office at midnight. The terms of our engagement have fundamentally shifted. See you at 9 a.m. "Where the hell is Arthur?" Simon Croft hissed, adjusting his collar. "We've been sitting here for 20 minutes, and what are we going to say about Richard if the Sterling board finds out our lead acquisition guy got arrested for racially profiling a VIP on an airplane?" "Shut up, Simon." Thomas snapped his eyes, darting toward the heavy double doors. "We deny everything. We say Richard had a medical emergency. We focus on the numbers. This Canary Wharf expansion is the only thing keeping Vanguard from defaulting on our mezzanine loans. We need this joint venture, or we are bankrupt by Q3. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors swung open. However, it wasn't the imposing silver-haired figure of Arthur Sterling who walked in. It was a 19-year-old black man wearing a tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit that draped flawlessly over his athletic frame. He carried a slim leather portfolio. His expression was impassive, projecting an aura of quiet, absolute authority. Thomas and Simon stared in total bewilderment. They had expected an army of ruthless corporate lawyers, not a teenager. Triton Sterling walked to the head of the table. He didn't sit down immediately. He placed his portfolio on the polished mahogany, opened it, and arranged a few documents. He then looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Thomas Harrington. "Good morning, gentlemen," Trey said, his voice smooth, professional, and chillingly calm. "My name is Triton Sterling. I am representing the chairman's office today." Simon Croft let out a nervous, condescending chuckle. "I'm sorry, kid. We are here to finalize a multi-billion-dollar joint venture. We need to speak with Arthur Sterling, or at least the regional director. This isn't a high school internship program." Trey didn't blink. He simply reached out and tapped a button on the teleconferencing console embedded in the table. Instantly, the massive 80-inch screen at the far end of the room flickered to life. The crisp, high-definition video feed revealed Arthur Sterling sitting behind a massive desk in his New York office. He looked formidable, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Mr. Croft." Arthur's voice boomed through the boardroom speakers, instantly silencing the room. "If you ever speak to my son and proxy with that tone again, I will personally ensure you never work in corporate finance for the rest of your natural life. Do we have an understanding?" Simon Croft turned chalk white, all the blood draining from his face. "Yeah. Yes, Mr. Sterling. My apologies." Thomas Harrington swallowed hard, trying to regain control of the room. "Arthur, it's good to see you. We are ready to proceed with the final signatures for the Canary Wharf initiative. I must apologize for Richard Caldwell's absence. He had an unexpected personal emergency." "It wasn't an emergency," Thomas Trey interjected seamlessly, taking his seat at the head of the table. "It was an eviction, and I was the one who evicted him." Thomas froze, his eyes darting between the teenager at the table and the chairman on the screen. The pieces violently clicked into place. The VIP Richard had harassed. The VIP Richard had called a thug. It wasn't just a wealthy passenger. It was the heir to the entire Sterling Empire. Mr. Harrington Trey continued opening a file. Let me save us all some time. We are not here to sign the joint venture. That deal is dead. Terminated. Sterling Global is officially withdrawing our letter of intent. You can't do that. Thomas panicked, standing up from his chair. We have a preliminary agreement. Vanguard has already leveraged millions in capital based on this partnership. If you pull out now, our stock will plummet. We will be ruined. You should have considered your company's vulnerability before you promoted a volatile, prejudiced liability to Senior Vice President Trey, stated smoothly. A man's character is indicative of the corporate culture that fostered him. Mr. Caldwell felt perfectly comfortable using his elite status to bully, intimidate, and attempt to illegally remove a black passenger from a flight simply because he felt superior. That level of reckless arrogance is a systemic issue, Mr. Harrington. It tells us that Vanguard Holdings lacks discipline ethics and proper oversight. He doesn't represent us. Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. I fired him. The moment I heard what happened, I terminated Richard Caldwell with cause. He has zero severance. His stock options are voided. Please, Arthur, look at the financials. This deal makes sense for both of us. On the screen. Arthur Sterling leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. Thomas, you don't seem to grasp the reality of your situation. You are bleeding capital. Your mezzanine loans are due in 90 days. You needed our liquidity to survive. But Sterling Global does not partner with sinking ships, and we certainly do not fund companies that employ men who disrespect my family. Arthur paused, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing. We are not partnering with Vanguard Holdings, Arthur finally said softly. As of 8 a.m. this morning, Sterling Global has initiated a hostile takeover of your primary competitor, Horizon Real Estate. We are injecting $5 billion into their pipeline. They will undercut every single one of your existing bids in the European market. Simon Croft gasped, dropping his gold pen. It clattered loudly against the table. It was a corporate death sentence. Arthur wasn't just walking away. He was actively funding their destruction. You are bankrupting us, Thomas whispered, collapsing back into his chair, a cold sweat breaking out across his back. Over an airplane seat. No, Mr. Harrington, Trey said, closing his leather portfolio with a sharp, definitive snap. We are bankrupting you over a lack of respect. Money is just currency. Respect is the foundation of power. Your company failed to understand the difference. We are done here. Trey stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the boardroom without looking back, leaving the Vanguard executives sitting in the ruins of their own making. The video feed on the screen clicked off, plunging the room into a deafening silence. 3,000 miles away in a stark, fluorescent-lit interrogation room at JFK Airport, Richard Caldwell's world had completely disintegrated. He had spent the last 14 hours in police custody. The Port Authority police had not been gentle with the belligerent executive. He had been fingerprinted, photographed, and charged with public disturbance, interfering with a flight crew, and trespassing after his ticket was officially revoked by the airline. When he was finally released on bail the following afternoon, looking disheveled, smelling of stale sweat, and wearing the same wrinkled suit, he turned on his cell phone. The screen immediately exploded with notifications. There were frantic voicemails from Thomas Harrington screaming that Vanguard was ruined and that Richard was fired effectively, immediately stripped of all benefits and pensions due to a gross violation of corporate ethics and public conduct. There was an alert from his bank. His corporate platinum card, his primary source of everyday funding, had been deactivated. But the final, most devastating blow came in the form of a cold clinical text message from his wife, Beatrice. I am not coming back to the Hampton house. My lawyers have already filed the paperwork. I have frozen our joint accounts, pending the asset division. Do not contact me. You are an embarrassment, Richard. Richard stood on the curb outside Terminal 4, the bitter New York wind whipping around him. He hailed a yellow cab, no longer able to use the elite black car service billed to his company. As he sat in the vinyl back seat, staring out at the gray highway, the sheer magnitude of his mistake crushed him. He had lost his multi-million-dollar job, his marriage, his reputation, and his freedom, all because he couldn't stand the sight of a black teenager sitting in a seat he felt entitled to. He had tried to assert his dominance over someone he deemed weak, only to discover he had attacked a fortress. Karma hadn't just hit him. It had systematically dismantled his entire life. Meanwhile, inside the corporate offices of Atlantic Continental Airlines in London, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. Sarah Jenkins sat rigidly in a hard plastic chair opposite Patricia Davies, the ruthless head of International Human Resources. On the desk between them lay Sarah's employee file, a shiny brass first-ass wings pin, and an official termination letter. "Miss Jenkins," Patricia said, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "We have reviewed the incident reports from Captain Harrison, the flight purser, and the official complaint filed by the Sterling family's legal counsel. You blatantly lied to a passenger. You fabricated a safety issue regarding weight distribution to illegally downgrade a fully ticketed VIP. I was under pressure." Sarah cried, the tears flowing freely now. "Mr. Caldwell was aggressive. He was a Diamond Elite member. I was trained to accommodate elite members. You were trained to ensure the safety and fair treatment of all passengers," Patricia corrected sharply. "You engaged in blatant racial profiling. You looked at a young black man and assumed he was illegitimate, while assuming the loud, aggressive white man was correct. You prioritized a mid-tier real estate executive over the son of the man who literally signs our paychecks." Patricia pushed the termination letter across the desk. "You are stripped of your flight status permanently. You are banned from employment with any airline operating under the Sterling Global Aviation umbrella. Sign the paperwork. Surrender your ID badge and security will escort you from the premises." Sarah's hand shook as she signed her name, effectively ending the career she had loved. 6 months later, unable to secure another job in aviation due to being blacklisted in the industry's shared databases, Sarah would find herself working the graveyard shift behind the counter of a budget rental car agency in New Jersey, forced to wear a polyester uniform and deal with I-8 travelers, a constant daily reminder of the luxury she had thrown away. Back in London, the sun finally broke through the overcast clouds, casting a golden light over the city. Triton Sterling sat on the balcony of his penthouse suite at the Savoy Hotel, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea. He had just finished reviewing the acquisition files for Horizon Real Estate. The hostile takeover had been swift and brutal. Vanguard holding stock had plummeted by 60% upon the news, and rumors were already swirling that Thomas Harrington would be forced to resign by the end of the week. Trey's phone buzzed on the glass table. It was his father. "The Horizon deal is locked," Arthur said, his voice brimming with pride. "Excellent work in the boardroom today, Trey. You handled Harrington perfectly. He was desperate, Dad. Desperation makes people sloppy," Trey replied, looking out over the River Thames. "And Caldwell?" Arthur asked. "Irrelevant," Trey answered simply. "He destroyed himself. We just handed him the tools. A harsh lesson, but a necessary one," Arthur agreed. "You showed restraint, Trey. You didn't yell. You didn't fight back in the mud with him. You used your intellect and your position. That is how you command respect. Are you ready for tomorrow's meetings in Paris always?" Trey smiled as he hung up the phone. Trey leaned back in his chair. The world was a complex, often unfair place, filled with people who judged books entirely by their covers. But Trey had learned a fundamental truth that week. You didn't have to raise your voice to deafen your enemies. You didn't have to throw a punch to break them. True power was quiet, elegant, and entirely devastating when provoked. Richard Caldwell had demanded a VIP seat, and in return, he had been given a front-row ticket to his own destruction. The incident on Flight 408 stands as a brutal modern-day testament to the reality that entitlement is a remarkably fragile armor. Richard Caldwell believed his wealth, his race, and his corporate status granted him ownership over spaces and people he deemed inferior. He weaponized his privilege to demean a quiet teenager, entirely unaware that he was attacking a giant. The universe, guided by the swift and unforgiving hand of Arthur and Triton Sterling, delivered a masterclass in karma. Within 24 hours, a man who had everything lost his career, his marriage, and his dignity. Sarah, the flight attendant who yielded to her own hidden prejudices, sacrificed her dream job for a lie. True power never needs to shout to be heard. It operates in the shadows, using leverage and intellect to dismantle ignorance. In the end, Caldwell didn't just lose a seat in first class. He lost his place in the world, proving that disrespect is the most expensive debt a person can incur.